The history of ITU is intimately connected with the human need to communicate, to exchange our thoughts and ideas, instructions and information with the people around us, but also farther across distances and across time. In today's digital age, with social media and instant communication, it seems natural to be able to connect with people anywhere in the world, anytime we want. But it wasn't always like this. For much of human history, communication across distance, in fact, was limited to light and sound signals or messenger, people, carrier pigeons, horses, and it wasn't very fast or reliable. So when the electric telegraph was invented in the early 1800s, it was a revolution for long-distance communication. Messages could be sent quickly and reliably across long distances for the first time. By the mid-19th century, many countries had established national telegraph systems. But sending messages across borders was difficult because each country had different systems and equipment. To address these challenges, 20 states met in Paris in 1865 and signed the first International Telegraph Conference to overcome barriers and make international communications more efficient. This convention harmonized regulations, tariffs, and technology and created the International Telegraph Union, the first version of ITU. Communication technology continued to evolve, and by the 1880s, long-distance communication was common by both telegraph and telephone, but both required wires or cables to transmit signals, which meant that it was difficult to communicate with remote locations. So the discovery that signals could be sent using radio waves made it possible to send messages to places that couldn't be connected by wires, such as ships at sea. This new technology, which was first called wireless telegraphy or radio telegraphy, rapidly became vital for maritime communications. By the early 1900s, it was common for ocean liners to have wireless equipment. However, problems soon arose, as they had in the early years of telegraphy. An issue was highlighted in 1902 when Prince Henry of Prussia, who had just visited the United States, wanted to send a message to the US president from his ship. But his message was refused because the shore station had different equipment. This incident led the German government to convene a conference to address the problems with radio telegraphy. The 1906 International Radio Telegraph Conference in Berlin brought together 30 maritime states to establish the first International Radio Telegraph Convention. This convention mandated intercommunication between ships and ship-to-shore, regardless of the systems that were being used. The convention also included the first set of radio regulations in a 15-page annex. Mario made reference to the 2024 edition of the radio regulations. These cover more than 2,000 pages and more than 40 services. It gives you an idea of how much things have changed and how important this first set of regulations was. This conference also requested the Bureau of the International Telegraph Union to provide the administrative services related to the convention. The union agreed and established a radio telegraph section, which started operation in 1907. And this is the predecessor for the Radio Communication Bureau of today. Early radio communications were very essential for emergency telecommunications. And this was recognized by the 1906 conference. They required telegraph stations on ships to give priority to distress signals and also specified a standard code, the SOS signal for distress signals. By 1912, however, the sinking of the ocean liner Titanic highlighted the need for more cooperation and coordination for emergency telecommunications. The already scheduled International Radio Telegraph Conference in London discussed safety at sea and safety in general, and came up with new regulations requiring or designating a telegraph signal, a radio signal specifically for distress calls, and requiring radio telegraph stations to listen for distress calls at regular intervals, 24 hours a day. After this, radio services continued to expand, including, for example, broadcasting, which allowed music, news, and entertainment to come into people's homes. This used a lot more, there was a lot more need for radio spectrum. And so the 1927 radio conference in Washington responded to the growing need for use of frequencies. It adopted the first table of frequency allocations and established a system for notifying frequencies. This was an important step for organizing and regulating the radio spectrum. The conference assigned frequency bands to various services like fixed, maritime, aeronautical, broadcasting, amateur, and experimental, ensuring that each service had its own space to operate without interference. This conference also established the International Radio Consultative Committee. It was to be a body of experts who would come together to study technical and operational questions in radio communications and to issue recommendations to improve the efficiency and availability of radio services worldwide. Initially, this body operated in plenary assemblies. This photo shows you the first assembly that was held in 1929. By 1948, it was agreed that the complexity of the studies required ongoing work, and the CCIR introduced study groups with specific terms of reference. The study groups and the assemblies continue today in the ITR study groups and the radio communication assemblies. By 1932, the member states felt that it would be useful to take a more holistic approach to managing the issues related to telecommunication technologies. And so the International Telegraph Convention and the International Radio Telegraph Convention were merged into one single treaty, and the Union decided to change its name to better reflect the new scope or the broadened scope of its responsibilities. The fairly new term telecommunications was used, and the ITU became the International Telecommunication Union. By the end of the Second World War, the continued expansion of radio services and more countries using these services raised great concerns about interference. So the 1947 International Radio Conference in Atlantic City established the International Frequency Registration Board, the IFRB. This body was responsible for maintaining a global register of radio frequencies and for preventing countries from using frequencies that would interfere with existing radio stations. Soon after it was established, the IFRB started publishing a regular information circular detailing all of the frequency assignments that had been reported to it by administrations worldwide. This system allowed member countries to be aware of new registrations and allowed them to raise concerns or objections if necessary. The first circular was published in October 1952, and the 3000th edition of that circular, now known as the BR-IFIC, International Frequency Information Circular, was published this year. In 1957, the launch of Sputnik 1 by the Soviet Union marked the beginning of the space age and introduced a new domain for telecommunications. As satellites became integral to telecommunications, it became necessary to manage the orbital slots for satellites. For just as with the radio frequency spectrum, the geostationary orbit around Earth is a limited natural resource and must be shared fairly and managed to avoid interference. As space activities expanded, ITU convened its first conference on space radio communications in 1963, bringing together 70 countries to revise frequency allocations and assign specific frequencies for radio services, for space radio services. Subsequent conferences have made additional allocations and for both frequency and rules for governing orbital slots. By 1992, the telecommunication environment had changed so much that the union recognized it needed to adapt. And a special meeting was called, the Additional Plenipotentiary Conference, in 1992 to reorganize ITU. ITU's primary activities were organized into 3 sectors. The CCIR and the IFRB were merged to create the radio communications sector, ITU-R, alongside ITU-T for telecommunication standardization and ITU-D for development. The Radio Communication Bureau, BR, serves as the secretariat for ITU-R, and responsibility for interpreting and monitoring compliance with the radio regulations was assigned to a new entity, the Radio Regulations Board. By this time, ITU was already involved in the research and development for 3G technology, laying the foundation for today's mobile communications, and you will hear much about this across this week. I hope that this brief historical overview has given you a glimpse of past developments and perhaps inspired you to think about future possibilities. There have been 3 constants to our story: the human desire to communicate, our capacity for innovation, and the constant need for international communication so that our communication and our innovations can be effective and efficient and benefit everyone. ITU has evolved from managing early wireless communication to overseeing the current mobile and satellite technologies, ensuring the efficient and equitable use of radio communications resources for global communication, connectivity, and knowledge sharing. If you would like to know more about ITU's history, please connect with the History of ITU portal on the ITU website at www.itu.int/history. Here you will find information about ITU's key dates, people, digitized documents from all of the radio conferences and other ITU conferences, all of the editions of the radio regulations, the ITU recommendations predating 1992, and much more information. It's all full text searchable and very interesting. If you have any questions about where to start, how to find information, don't hesitate to contact the ITU Library and Archives by email or phone, or come in and visit us, and we would be happy to help you find the information you need to understand the background to a recommendation or regulation, or to find inspiration for the next innovation. Thank you.